In our previous Datum Line broadcast entitled Economic Myths and the Science of Deceit, Part 35, we re-examined a few popular myths concerning America's political economy that my generation was conditioned to accept. I say conditioned because the method by which we were led to our conclusions utilized a menu of predetermined and limited choices so as to control the decision outcome. Society is always subject to changing forces from within and from without, being given moral, political, and economic direction from people and institutions we've been taught to respect for their wisdom and understanding. In today's message, we'll be looking at an insidious method that has come to bear on this subject of social change, ostensibly to liberate us from the tyranny of religion, particularly a rightly divided biblical perspective that was once taught and helped to guide our ship of state. Over the last 150 years, however, America has turned nearly 180 degrees from her previous course. Those who look to Washington as the fount of all wisdom and solutions to our many problems see these changes as proof of man's evolutionary progress on his way to self-deification, while others are horrified by our self-destructive folly and arrogance. If a dictatorship of the elite is our best and most intelligent choice, as so many seem to believe, then why do our respected institutions have to trick people into choosing it? Regarding this question, let's add another myth, one claiming that America is still the land of free choice. One of the first examples of a deceitful menu that I recognized at the time was when my 9th grade history teacher drew a diagram of the complete political spectrum on the blackboard back in the early 1960s. Communism was listed on the far left, fascism on the far right, with socialism tucked comfortably in the middle. What a selection. An all-powerful government, no matter where we looked. And all of them, as I would later learn, were socialist. This was a fail-proof menu designed for a 14-year-old who was politically neutral but understood the process of elimination. Let's see now. I'm not a communist. You see, we were in a Cold War with the communists back then. And I'm not a fascist. We had defeated them a few years earlier in World War II. So therefore, I must be a socialist. Hey, with education like this, and a private school no less, is it any wonder that my generation can watch a political debate between Tweedledee and Tweedledum as if it makes sense? My classmates were already acclimated to a socialist system of old age insurance, that was called Social Security, adopted by FDR's New Deal during the 1930s, but was first introduced under European socialist political economic systems. Socialized medicine then followed in the early 1960s under the Kennedy administration, known today as Medicare. Its evolutionary descendant is universal health care on the road to a global government that will decide when we begin life, our function in life, when life will end, and how. Our European cousins are on the same road, having started their journey a little earlier. Michael Moore, in his documentary Sicko, portrayed the French healthcare system as superior to ours, but he also accepted a predetermined and limited menu. A socialist government monopoly over there, or a fascist corporate monopoly over here. Both are socialist, with ever-changing nuances, and both exact a price from their subjects. Government big enough to supply everything you need is big enough to take everything you have, said Thomas Jefferson. As to the French system, Michael Moore avoided the subject of taxation, government regulation, and the negative impact of bureaucracy so typical of any socialist monopoly. There's a pathological link between health care and banking which led to the limited menu of choices used to guide the human herd down the cattle chute, into the feedlot of government freebies, and finally to the slaughterhouse of ultimate cost that was concealed from the unwitting victims. Both bankers and medical practitioners acquired tremendous leverage over the American public during the 20th century. Prior to that time, health care was often provided by a family doctor who made house calls using non-invasive natural remedies handed down from one generation to the next. With the increasing influence of science and technology, underwritten by financiers like J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller, who saw the economic potential for heroic medicine, as it was then called, the tide began to turn. Coupled with a changing worldview from biblical Christianity to secular humanism, we became eager to control our environment in ways previously unimaginable. Man was becoming like God, and with the desire for more control came the means by which to exercise it more effectively. Corporations blossomed to replace individual proprietorships, fertilized by credit, begetting a hothouse of giant monopolies to choke out their competitors like weeds. Allopathic medicine began to organize under an economic and political umbrella called the American Medical Association to unseat their rivals of natural healing. With its own propaganda arm headed by Morris Fishbein, the AMA began a campaign to rid the country of their competitors, who they labeled as quacks, enlisting the Food and Drug Administration to provide necessary federal muscle. Perhaps the most riveting battle of the 20th century involved the AMA-FDA versus the Hoxsey cancer clinics that were forcibly closed, later reopening in Mexico where they continued alternative treatments said to be 80% effective. That was tough and unwanted competition for an outfit that some doctors quietly admit buries far more of its cancer patients. At the same time, a banking monopoly emerged by forging a link with Congress, the Federal Reserve System erasing its competition from lawful money, gold and silver, by orchestrating its confiscation, leaving in its wake a monopoly of intangible credit created out of nothing at interest, upon which the non-bank public is now totally dependent. Organized medicine linked up with medical-related industries like insurance and pharmaceutical companies, along with law firms, to represent them, all looped into the revolving door at FDA to keep the game running smoothly. With economic success comes a good line of credit from the godmen of banking, who appreciate the economic potential generated by allopathic hospitals. If you live in Cleveland, for example, you're probably wondering when Progressive Insurance and the Cleveland Clinic will finally devour the last square foot of Cleveland real estate. Megacorporations can breed nasty business practices, the kind that has ransacked our economy with Chinese imports and healthcare costs that rival the price of a nice airplane. Curing a problem licensed by government in the first place is left to the ultimate monopoly, since Uncle Sam, with the Federal Reserve, is the only one with pockets deep enough to achieve the impossible. We're not even asking Congress to change the kind of therapy from symptomatic relief to natural cures. No, sir. A federal solution is posited on just one premise: that Uncle Sam has more dollars than anyone else, and our nation's debilitated population is convinced that if they can tap into it, if they can but touch the hem of his garment, they will be healed. Our message today is entitled Economic Myths and the Science of Deceit. This is part 36. You're listening to Datum Line, and I'm Bruce G. McCarthy. On the other side of this break, we will continue with an examination of the false paradigms that the American people have been forced to accept by mainstream media and by modern-day public education. You know, Americans are continually choosing from a limited menu that was predetermined by the ruling elite to assure the politically correct outcome. In our previous example, the choice was between a private monopoly operating in tandem with government versus a federally funded government monopoly more perfectly merged with its favorite corporate giants. The number 4 cause of premature death today is from the medications prescribed to treat the first 3. If the method of treatment is the same on both sides of the menu, however, why should we expect the results to improve? The choice we're denied on both sides of this menu is the full spectrum of healthcare alternatives afforded by a free enterprise system which once existed when the old-fashioned country doctor was not subject to the AMA dictatorship. Our economic system is lubricated by synthetic bank credit, which, thanks to government, drove out its lawful competitors, gold and silver, so as to establish a credit monopoly. As the only game in town, they finally aroused enough public suspicion to at least make economics and banking a topic of discussion. Unfortunately, the menu that's being slowly unveiled for the public to choose from is between a privately owned credit monopoly and a government-owned credit monopoly. There is no place at the table to address credit creation as theft, ordinarily punished by law if it's perpetrated by anyone else outside of either monopoly. Mainstream media will never entertain the idea of a natural lubricant for the economy that's subject to natural law. Imagine for a moment a system where government could only spend what we send them instead of what they don't have. However, that would make government a servant responsive to the people who pay them in gold and silver, instead of being the master over servants dependent upon dollars of absolutely nothing that flow out of Washington. Now let's look at another example of this false paradigm of one unlawful credit system allegedly opposed to another. Back in August of this year, 2013, American Free Press carried an article written by Ronald L. Ray. It was entitled, "Hungary Sheds Bankers' Shackles," in issue number 34, August 26, at page 5. His subtitle, "International Monetary Fund Told to Vacate the Country." Well, so far so good. "Nation now issuing debt-free money." Not so good. His economics vocabulary is most questionable. If debt-free money means a tangible substance like gold, silver, copper, or even reams of good quality 8.5 by 11-inch paper, then those can be delivered or paid into the marketplace debt-free. But if he means raw numbers that measure a quantity of intangible credit, however they measure credit in Hungary, then those will never, ever enter the economy as debt-free money. For the benefit of news listeners, debt is defined as a sum of money due, referring to Black's Law Dictionary, which relies upon State versus Doucet in one edition after another. Until 1963, all United States and private bank notes, like the Federal Reserve notes, were simply promises to pay money pursuant to the long-standing definition of a note. But let's restate the definition of debt for a clearer understanding of an error that's incessantly repeated by so many Federal Reserve critics, especially of the populist persuasion. Debt is the undelivered portion of an economic exchange. Let's say the exchange calls for 3,000 board feet of number 2 Southern pine lumber to be paid for with 50 bushels of Temple oranges, but you only deliver 45 bushels. Then the debt is 5 bushels of Temple oranges. If you tried to purchase the lumber with $800 in Federal Reserve notes, what would you use or be using as money to pay for them? Paper? Well, people call it paper money, don't they? But how much paper is exchanged with $100 bills? Just 8 little pieces of it. But how much debt-free money would a populace say you delivered? $800 of it. But what and where is the stuff everybody is so willing to call it? The it spoken of is intangible and exists only in the mind. Now, if you're the party of original issue, such as the Federal Reserve or Congress, or the writer of rubber checks that bounce, then your game of imaginary and pretended exchange is profitable indeed. A note that promises to pay no money in a system that uses nothing as money costs no money to produce, not even a few cents of it. If you disagree, then simply identify the monetary substance used by the Federal Reserve System in Congress to purchase all the supplies needed to print a $100 bill. You know, paper, ink, labor, printing press, and so forth. If you've got your mind right, like Paul Newman in Cool Hand Luke, then you should be able to perceive the most colossal fraud ever played upon mankind. But back to the $800 offer for 3,000 board feet of lumber. That's all it is, an offer. Read a Federal Reserve note. This note is legal tender. The word tender means offer. An offer of money is not money. You'll probably get the lumber, of course, but you won't pay for it with money. The lawful debt will remain $800. How do you calculate it? That's 800 times 412.5 grains of 0.900 fine silver, or 800 times 25.8 grains of 0.900 fine gold, as defined by statute when the United States utilized a monetary system in order to effect monetary payment. The American economy has been deferring payment with 100% credit since 1965, a subject covered in previous messages. But back to the article in American Free Press. Mr. Ray says, quote, Hungary is making history of the first order. Not since the 1930s in Germany has a major European country dared to escape the clutches of the Rothschild-controlled international banking cartels, end quote. Now, the author makes an interesting comparison here, since Germany of the 1930s was under a national socialist regime. So let's see where this goes in light of the full spectrum of socialist menu that was fed to my freshman class in the 1960s by an avowed socialist history teacher. Back to Mr. Ray, quote, Already in 2011, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban promised to serve justice on his socialist predecessors, who sold the nation's people into unending debt slavery under the lash of the International Monetary Fund and the terrorist state of Israel. End quote. Viktor Orban's socialist predecessors sold the country into debt slavery, but under what? Under a credit system of fiat money. And his National Socialist regime is going to get them out. How? With a credit system that uses fiat money. What's wrong with this picture? Our concern is with the competing political and economic philosophies, which in substance are actually no different. This was made clear by a devoted American Nazi with whom I spoke years ago, when he insisted that the Federal Reserve System would work wonders once it was in the right hands, in what he called a perfect Aryan society. The problem with the Federal Reserve, as he saw it, were threefold. One, it's privately owned. Two, the Jews, as he called them, own it. And three, they charge usury. Bear with me, please, while I digress a little further. Number one, private ownership is not what makes the Federal Reserve System criminal or sinful. If that were true, then private ownership of an automobile or a house would be a punishable offense. It's what bankers do that makes banking sinful or criminal. On the other side of the break, we had brought up the subject of the Nazi solution to America's or anybody else's economic problems. And an American Nazi who I had talked with said that there was a threefold problem. And the first part of that problem was that the Federal Reserve System is privately owned. As I mentioned, private ownership is not a crime. Private ownership is not even a sin. If that were so, then you couldn't own a house privately. You'd be punished. It's what bankers do that makes banking sinful. They steal. Whoever can create principal out of nothing does so to steal the wealth of others, which is why you go to jail if you compete with those chosen few people by printing and spending a few of those bucks of your own. Second, using the word Jew, J-E-W, fuels another false paradigm created to conceal the truth. The Apostle John identifies the enemies of Christian liberty. Oh, by the way, Christian liberty requires a free enterprise economic system, doesn't it? He defines those people as being those who say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan and do lie. Revelation 2:9 and Revelation 3:9. We'll address the third item of usury in a moment, which was the third objection that the American Nazi had to the Federal Reserve System. This would be an appropriate place to inject a relevant question by the Apostle Paul, who asked, rhetorically, shall we do evil that good may come? Find that at Romans chapter 3 and verse 8. Paul was opposing a pragmatic doctrine that says the ends justify the means. A lawful judgment does not result from unlawful methods. Paul was restating what King Solomon had written 3,000 years ago. He said, "Envy thou not the oppressor, and choose none of his ways." That found in Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 31. The problem with populist and Nazi thinking in general is that their focus is principally limited to who runs the machinery of oppression, overlooking the sin that's being perpetrated in hopes of getting to operate the same levers of power themselves. Their standard of reference prevents them from seeing the crime, aspects of which most Americans seem to enjoy as victims. Else would the elite have brought us under bondage so easily. Evildoers use evil methods, but double-minded victims love to have it so. But back to Mr. Ray, who says, quote, "No longer will Hungarians be forced to pay usurious interest to private unaccountable central bankers," end quote. What is meant by the redundant expression, usurious interest? During the last few hundred years, the root word usury morphed into something other than what was originally meant. Most dictionaries provide a breakdown of this change. I'll use Black's Law Dictionary 5th edition as an example. We turn to the word usury. 1. Definition number 1. An unconscionable and exorbitant rate or amount of interest. End quote. So therefore, usurious interest apparently means an interest rate that is not guided or restrained by conscience. In other words, it's unreasonable. A problem arises, of course, when we disagree on the standard used to establish what constitutes exorbitant, excessive, or unconscionable. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob Israel set the standard in Scripture, which we'll get to in a moment. But society, even ours, has a way of ignoring him. I'm going to quote from a history of banking in all the leading nations. You've heard us use that in times past, wherein it says, quote, "In 1361, now that's a long time ago, in 1361, John the Good," now John the Good was a French king, John the Good allowed Jews to charge 130% interest per annum. This taken from a history of banking in all the leading nations, edited by William Graham Sumner, volume 2 at page 3, published in 1896. Now, this word Jew shows up again, doesn't it? Why do we call certain other people Jews? Well, most likely because they call themselves by that name. But as any police officer knows, not everyone is who they say they are. Again, Revelation 2:9 and 3:9. Now, would you be of the opinion that 130% interest is just a little bit steep? And is 130% usurious interest? Is it usury? Or is it just simply interest? Your frame of reference will determine the answer. Who's making the rules? Is it God or is it man? And are the rules subject to revision? The second definition from Black's Law Dictionary, 5th edition, with respect to usury, the second definition, quote, "In Old English law, usury was defined as interest." Did you catch that? Not 130% interest, any interest. Usury was defined as interest of money. Increase for the loan of money. The taking of any compensation whatsoever for the use of money, end quote. Where would the English have gotten such an idea? Perhaps being closer to and more respectful of the ancient precepts, maybe they learned it from a preacher, who in turn learned it from the Bible, a book that did not use the word interest, using instead the word usury. In the book of Nehemiah, written about 2,500 years ago, that would be about the year 444 BC, the prophet Nehemiah was confronted by an economic crisis pertaining to debtors who had mortgaged their lands, vineyards, and houses so as to buy food and pay the king's taxes. Things were so bad in the city of in the city of Jerusalem, that they had even sold their children into bondage as a result. So Nehemiah took issue with the creditors on behalf of the debtors, saying, in Nehemiah 5, verse 7, "Ye exact usury, every one of you, is of his brother," or countryman. And how much interest did they charge on the money? Which was silver, by the way. That was number 3701 in Strong's Exhaustive Concordance. That's the Hebrew word kesef there. What was the rate of interest that they charged on the money that they loaned? Well, in Nehemiah chapter 5 and verse 10, he says to them, "I pray you, let us leave off this usury." He went further, a lot further in verse 11. "Restore, I pray you, to them even this day their lands, their vineyards, their olive yards, and their houses." Now we're going to get to what the interest charge was. "Also the 1/100th part of the money." That word money there, number 3701 again, it's the word silver. "The wine and the oil that ye exact of them." Usury was interest, and it equaled as little as 1/100th of a part, which is what percent? 1%. Nowhere does the Bible distinguish between an acceptable and an unacceptable rate of interest, as some people seem to believe, where some people say that 6% and above might be usury, but 5% and under is interest. Show me where the Bible says that, and I'll stand down. Now, back to Mr. Ray, who says, quote, in his article, "The Hungarian government has assumed sovereignty over its own currency and now issues money debt-free as it is needed," end quote. Mr. Ray points to this Hungarian example as an inspiration for the rest of the world to follow, including the United States. And considering our wretched spiritual condition and lack of economic understanding, we probably will. It's another false paradigm, however, a menu of very limited choices with free enterprise and limited government not included in the menu. In this one sentence, Mr. Ray inserts several controversial elements. 1, sovereignty of government. 2, currency. And 3, debt-free money. We've already addressed these subjects in greater detail in previous broadcasts, but for new listeners, it's important to lay a brief foundation, at least, before we proceed. Regarding sovereignty of government, number 1. Under the United States Constitution and state constitutions, our federal government was not sovereign over domestic affairs. Only in respect to America's foreign relations was it to act in a sovereign capacity involving matters of international trade or in the prosecution of war, a view believed and upheld by the courts for almost 80 years. Which is about how long the Constitution may have lasted in this country. This would change with a revolting Supreme Court case known as Juliet versus Greenman that was decided in 1884. That's a subject that we covered earlier in this series in greater detail. Regarding currency, issue number 2 in Mr. Ray's article, a word generally reserved for legal tender notes and former gold and silver certificates, there is absolutely no constitutional authority for these instruments of credit, even if they were 100% redeemable in lawful money, gold and silver. End of story. That's been covered also. We're going to move on to part 3 of Mr. Ray's error, and that has to do with debt-free money, a phrase used incessantly by populists and other Federal Reserve critics, and they usually mean it to mean United States notes, in defiance of the very definition of a note. In fact, the notes that they propose don't even have a promise to pay the money on them. They are 100% debt instruments. They are not debt-free. But back to Mr. Ray. He says, the results have been nothing short of remarkable. He doesn't prove that, but he says it. The nation's economy, formerly staggering under deep indebtedness, has recovered rapidly and by means not seen since National Socialist Germany. End quote. Again, the author's benchmark of success is National Socialist Germany, Nazi for short, which he innocuously referred to in the beginning as Germany in the 1930s. Like the socialist FDR administration over here, the Third Reich capitalized on tremendous government spending programs which appeared to bring both countries out of the economic doldrums. Germany prepared for war, which provided a great economic stimulus, certainly, but by 1945, no one in his right mind would have cited Germany as a paragon of economic success. The United States did not begin to see economic recovery under FDR until we adopted the same program a few years later than Germany. All of this came at a tremendous cost over here, measured in lives lost in combat, a full range of injuries sustained in combat, social change that would jeopardize the family unit once Rosie the Riveter became accustomed to the workforce, a massive national debt, increasing dependence on government entitlement programs regulated under the Administrative Procedures Act, and a loss of personal liberty, just to name a few. We certainly don't want to unnecessarily disparage any positive results that the Hungarians might enjoy as a consequence of giving the IMF their walking papers and showing them the door. There are those who would applaud their efforts to be rid of the bankers no matter how it was accomplished, however. But there's a right way and a wrong way to achieve your purposes. If your goal is lawful, as God defines that and not as sinful man defines it, then the means to achieve your ends must likewise be lawful. Remember, Solomon said in Proverbs 33:31, "Envy thou not the oppressor and choose none of his ways." Debt-free money is a code word of populism for intangible credit, which is the source of phenomenal, by that I mean breathtaking, power for whoever gets to create it. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, said Lord Acton. No, that's not a verse from the Bible. But Lord Acton condensed the biblical view of man into one sentence about as well as anyone ever did. Going back to the political spectrum depicted on the blackboard in my 9th grade classroom 50 years ago, you recall that it was socialist under 3 different banners. We can even allow for the possibility of various nuances that might appear or disappear over time as our fallible and arrogant potentates amend their socialist program to correct its many deficiencies. If they knew how bad things were going to turn out, they might begin with version 91 at the outset, but only God can know the beginning from the end. Mr. Ray, you recall, pitted Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban against his socialist predecessors while his administration tossed out one socialist economic system run by a private cartel in order to introduce another socialist economic system run by a different cartel called government. They're the same system. Each begins with a spirit of hope and excitement, what Mr. Obama called change, to which his congregation chanted, "Yes, we can. Yes, we can." Each system uses absolutely nothing as money. Each system violates the law of just weights and measures commanded in Scripture, since to apply such a law requires that there be something to weigh and measure. Each system authorizes the first party of issue to steal whatever it wants from the rest of society. The result being the concentration of economic and political power in the hands of that party. Populists want that power to be in the hands of Uncle Sam. Our founding fathers left it in the hands of we, the people, pursuant to the Constitution and the original Coinage Act of April 2nd, 1792. The party of original issue for our lawful money, gold and silver, under the Constitution was we, the people, pursuant to Section 14 of the Coinage Act of April 2nd, 1792. But I believe that it was we who dropped the ball on that one. "What did you give us, sir?" asked the woman of Benjamin Franklin as he exited the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention in 1787. "A republic," he said, "if you can keep it." We did not keep it. We were too busy chasing our personal rainbows. So now it's easier to blame someone else for our own failings, to insist that someone else fix the mess we helped to create, by ignoring our civic responsibilities, which go far beyond simply voting for political candidates who promise great things at the expense of violating their oath of office in order to enslave their constituents. Proponents of liberty don't seem to be doing any better. Here is a typical example. From Bill Still, No More National Debt, which he published in 2011. This from page 2. Concerning our economic problem, he says, quote, "We can fix it, you and I. Just average people with no special training can understand what the problem is and insist on change. End quote. What's wrong with that, you ask? For some people, to understand what the problem is falls far short of understanding the problem. Yeah, we understand what the problem is, so tell us the solution. Well, if we understood the problem, which includes the cause and not just some of its effects, then we'd know what to do about it. Here's what Dr. Anthony Santelli said on September 14th of 2013 at a Catholic Restoration Conference, number 7 in Washington. His presentation entitled, Money and Banking in a Catholic Social Order. Here's what he said. Quote, I think we all know there are problems with the existing money and banking system. So I'm not going to spend half the lecture on that. I'm mainly going to propose a solution and compare different monetary reform proposals, end quote. Well, Mr. Santelli, our first and foremost monetary problem is that we don't have any existing money, and therefore do not have a monetary system to correct. I would submit that if we cannot discern the difference between a monetary system and a credit system, then we certainly do not understand the problem. The folks who attended that conference must have left as confused as when they arrived, if not even more so. Well, we're coming close to the end of this broadcast, and I've been hammering away at various myths. I'm not done. I've got a few more. We will be condensing those here in the next few broadcasts. In fact, I think I'm even going to do a recap of all the myths. Believe it or not, there are a lot of myths that we've covered, one way or another, directly or indirectly. We're going to do a recap of the myths, perhaps in the next broadcast, while introducing maybe one or two more new ones. And again, I'll ask you, if you know some economic myths out there, or if you have some misconceptions, or if maybe you're concerned or confused about some things in this subject, I'm not saying I can answer all your questions, but I'd certainly give it a shot. We have been inundated by so many myths and misconceptions that the general public cannot see its way out of this wet paper bag. All it takes is an accurate vocabulary to do so, however. Then we will go into the subject of solutions, both from a national perspective and from a personal perspective. But I am a realist. I am not one who sees America as being ready, not even close to ready, to adopting a lawful solution. We are a people who like Band-Aid solutions. We want symptomatic relief, and that's why allopathic medicine, which was forced upon us as a monopoly, became the accepted method of treatment. That's the method we want. Give me a pill. Give me an injection. If you have to, cut it out of me so that I can go back to living the way I did before. That's the way Americans treat everything. I'm an American. I was raised the same way. But if we want to solve this problem, we have to go to the cause, not dealing with simply treating the effects. So, again, I've been hammering away at the populists and now even the American Nazis. Folks, you've got to take a little closer look at this subject and start defining your terms more carefully. What then? Shall we do evil that good might come? The Apostle Paul would have said, heaven forbid.